A PhD in education and looking for something new. Bianca enrolled in a 6-month web dev bootcamp, fell in love with Ruby on Rails and never looked back. But the question is, does she pair?
I heard she does on fun languages like Ruby, as well as less fun ones too.
She says pair programming is a great way to learn more about a language and a great opportunity to share with others the things you love about it.
Final speaker for today, Bianca Power. Ruby makes my brain happy.
Thank you for that introduction. It's fantastic to be here with you all in person today and to talk about Ruby. A little bit more about where I'm coming from. So I spent a bit over 17 years working in education. My original undergrad degree was as a primary school teacher. I then went and did a PhD in education, and I taught in various places in various ways throughout that time. As I was finishing my PhD, I had a little bit of PhD burnout, and I kind of was feeling the pressure of the publish or perish mentality of academia, and I knew that I really wanted to go and do something where I could actually make a difference in the world, do things that mattered. And I'd been playing around with learning to code for a few years by this point, but I always kind of kept hitting a bit of a wall when trying to learn that on my own. Long story short, I found a coding bootcamp at a place called Coder Academy, and I went and joined in July 2017. I started that bootcamp, and we learnt Ruby, we learnt Rails, we learnt a JavaScript stack as well, and I absolutely fell in love with coding, and particularly in Ruby. So I stayed there for 6 months as a bootcamp student, and then I got the opportunity to stay on and teach, and long story short, I was there for 5 years, all up, at Coder Academy, and for me that was a really great time to meet a whole lot of different developers at different points in their careers, because yes, I was a part of the journey of the hundreds of students we had coming through, but we also had different people from industry coming in to teach, and sometimes they were people who had just finished the boot camps reasonably recently. Maybe they'd worked in industry for a year and then come back to teach, but other people had literally been doing Rails for as long as Rails has existed. So a really wide range of people that I got to work with there, which was really, really cool. Last year, I moved into industry and started working as a full-stack Rails dev. I've put Rails dev there, which might be kind of subconscious because actually it was a Rails and React dev, but I've just put Rails dev on the slide. The topic of my talk is Ruby makes my brain happy, and I'm going to be talking about that from the experiences that I've had with coding, and also looking at what I've noticed in the developers that I've worked with over the 5 years of working with a whole range of different developers. This talk is really about two things. I wanted to talk about the awesomeness of Ruby, and Ruby is awesome. But as I was writing this talk, I kept coming back to talking about the brains, and the educator in me kept wanting to talk about kind of the way that our brains work and how we're all different. So it's really a talk about two things, the awesomeness of Ruby and a talk about our brains. So to talk about those two things, I'm going to talk more about my experiences. I'm going to talk about what makes us all unique and touch on some theories around cognitive development. I'm going to talk about happiness. I'm going to talk about what's special about Ruby, and I'm also going to talk about how these things can actually be useful to us in our daily lives. A little bit more about my experiences learning to code. So if we ignore a few false starts where I learnt C++ kind of, and then my laptop got stolen and I didn't know about Git yet, and that really didn't go well. The first language where I felt like I was actually coding, I was actually able to express myself in code, I was actually able to build things. For me, that first language was Ruby. I also became reasonably competent in JavaScript and passable in Python, and I learnt some C and some bash scripting along the way. But what I kept finding was that I always wanted to go back to Ruby. And especially as I was going through that bootcamp where we learnt Ruby, we learnt Rails, then we went on and we learnt a JavaScript stack, the people on the internet, there's a lot of talk on the internet about how JavaScript is the way of the future for web development. And obviously I'm not saying that we don't need to know JavaScript as web developers, of course we do, but there's this push around this is what industry's doing, this is what we should be focusing on. But for me, that kind of led to me feeling guilty because I knew that I was loving to code in Ruby. And I was learning JavaScript too, but if I was just building something for fun, I'd go and build it in Ruby. And there was this tension between what should I be focusing on while I'm trying to learn. And one of the things that I want to say today is I think it's really important and really valuable to embrace the things that we enjoy doing. I think that I learned tons about JavaScript even by coding in Ruby. The more that you code, the more you're going to learn about it, and there's something to be said for embracing the things that you enjoy working with. So I'm one of 4 siblings, and 3 of us work as developers. I'd love to take some sort of data point on whether that's rare at some point, but I love working in Ruby. My brother Theo works in Elixir, and he'll talk all day about functional programming, and he's constantly trying to convert me to Elixir. And our younger brother Logan works in Python. He kind of agrees with me on what I work with day to day is better than JavaScript bandwagon, but his is Python and mine is Ruby. And our youngest brother Alex hasn't quite got into coding yet. I say yet because he's only 19, and the way the other 3 of us have gone, I figure it's only a matter of time. So that's just a tiny, very biased sample, but let's talk a little bit more broadly. As I mentioned, I had an opportunity to work with hundreds and hundreds of developers over the 5 years that I worked in a coding bootcamp. And that included people who were just starting out in their journeys, learning their first language in most cases. And I got to see and be a part of their journey of them learning their first language and then learning their second language. Typically it was Ruby and then JavaScript, but sometimes it was Python, then JavaScript. And working with them, but also working with very experienced developers who had been working in the industry from decades and coming from a whole range of different experiences, well, most of my talk today is about how we're all different, but I think there's one common thread that kind of ties devs together, no matter your background, no matter our backgrounds, and that's that devs are opinionated. Whether it's about the text editors that we use, or the operating systems, or the languages that we code in, we really do tend to be an opinionated bunch, almost to the point where it can seem quite intense, the amount of emotion that we put into defending these tools that we use. But actually, to me, that makes perfect sense, because we spend so much of our time, so much of our brain capacity goes into working in these environments on a daily basis often. I think it makes perfect sense that we want to work with tools, we want to work within languages that map well to our brain. Environments and languages that make our brains happy. Let's talk a little bit more about what makes us unique, because we are all uniquely different. I think it's pretty well understood these days that neurodiversity is a thing, and in fact there are a couple of really great talks yesterday on neurodiversity as well. So I'm not going to talk about neurodiversity other than to just remind you that it's a thing. We are all neurodiverse. You may have also heard of nature versus nurture, the idea that we as individuals are the way that we are because of a combination of the way that we were born to be and the experiences that we have throughout our lifetimes. It's possible that we're predisposed towards a particular way of thinking or a particular way of seeing the world at birth, but most people would agree that the way that we see the world, the way that we think, the way that we process things does change throughout our lifetime. And I'm going to keep coming back to this theme throughout the presentation. You may have also heard of learning styles or learning preferences, and these terms do get a bit of bad press around how they get used in education, but the general underlying idea that we all think differently, and perhaps because of that or related to that, we all have different ways in which we'd prefer to take in new information, that's something that most people, again, would agree with. So if you think about yourselves or the people that you know, perhaps you prefer to learn something by reading, or perhaps you prefer to watch a video. Perhaps you prefer to listen to an audiobook rather than read, or I think that would be a little bit weird if it was a coding book. I'm not sure how that would work, but you never know. When it comes to learning new technology, think about how you would prefer to approach it. Do you just dive in and try and build something and figure stuff out, or do you read the docs, or do you watch a video of somebody taking you through the technology? Most likely you do some combination of those things. These things don't exist in isolation typically, but you probably have a strong preference towards one or two of them. What's great these days, especially with the internet and with everything that we have available to us today, is that there are so many different options that we have for learning new things that it's actually possible for us to find ways to learn what we want to learn in ways that are most likely to work for us. And that's really cool. And when it comes to programming languages, there are so many different programming languages out there. When it comes to tools that we can use, there are so many different ones out there. When it comes to frameworks, well, let's not start counting, but there's a lot. I want to talk a little bit about some theories on the brain. I want to take a little bit of a dip into educational psychology. We won't go too deep, but this guy is one of the founding fathers of the theories on cognitive development, and in an educational psychology setting. And so this is Piaget, and among other things, Piaget talks about his theories on adapting to new knowledge, how we as individuals adapt to the knowledge that we're taking in. This theory is based around the concepts of assimilation and accommodation. He says that we start out with this existing container of knowledge, that we all have this existing container of knowledge. So this is what we already know, basically. Assimilation is what happens when we encounter a new idea. So some new information has come our way. Basically, what we tend to do is we grab that new idea and we shove it into our existing container of knowledge. Makes sense, I guess. We grab it and we shove it in there, but we kind of just don't worry too much about whether it fits too well. We just shove it in there, we see what happens. Typically at that point, what is happening is that it doesn't quite fit. If you just sort of take something that already exists, if you just sort of take something and try to shove it into your existing knowledge bank without adapting anything, it doesn't tend to quite work. We enter this state of disequilibrium where things are a little off balance. To give you a really quick example of what that looks like, imagine a small child who has a pet dog, and they know all about dogs. They've been to the dog park, they know lots of dogs, they can see a dog and they can say that's a dog. But what they've never seen before is a horse. And so they go to their uncle's farm, and their uncle has a horse, and they see that horse, and they go, dog. Because that's a four-legged animal, and you know, it's got a bunch of other factors. And the closest thing that they can get when they take that new information, that new animal that they're seeing, and they try to shove it in their existing container of knowledge, the closest they can come to that is dog. It's the closest category they can find. They know it doesn't quite fit though. They enter this state of disequilibrium where they're like, yeah, it's a dog, and they might even confidently say dog, but they know that it doesn't quite fit. Luckily, their uncle comes along and says that's a horse, and they trust their uncle, so now they have some new information to go on. Now they can accommodate that information. They can restructure their existing knowledge. So now they have a label horse, and now they'll be able to start categorizing dogs and horses differently. So they're in that accommodation phase of adapting to new knowledge. Once this happens, things start to come back into balance, things start to make sense again, and we go into this state of equilibrium. And then rinse and repeat with all the new things that we're learning all the time. Piaget, the guy that came up with this theory, he actually had a name for it. He didn't actually talk about it as adapting to new knowledge, he had a name for it. He called it schemas. Does that remind you of anything in the worlds that we work in? I think it's actually a pretty good analogy to talk about database schemas with regards to this kind of thing. Because essentially what we're doing as humans every day is we're taking in new data, new representations of how existing things should be structured. A database schema and our internal schemas are hopefully accurate representations of things at a point in time. And then when things change, when the world around us changes, when the needs of the application change, then we're going to need to go and adapt those schemas. We need to take in the new information, but we need to actually accommodate it as well. We need to change and adapt our schemas as we go, as we're learning things, as our needs change. And we're all lifelong learners. Especially as developers, we're constantly problem solving, we're learning new technologies, getting across new code bases. We're constantly learning new things. And as much as I want to talk about doing things in a way that makes our brains happy, it's also really important to make sure that we do keep pushing outside of our comfort zones, pushing ourselves to learn. But I think that there's actually a nice relationship between the two things, where by understanding the things that make us happy, what puts us in our comfort zones, by understanding that about ourselves, about other people as well, that can help us to push ourselves out of our comfort zones in ways that are actually most conducive to that learning. So let's talk about happiness. The topic of my talk is Ruby makes my brain happy. But what does that mean? And without getting too existential about it all, what even is happiness anyway? I don't think that there's one definition for happiness. I think that what happiness is different for all of us, and it should be different for all of us. We're all neurodiverse, and we've all come through a lifetime worth of different experiences to each other. So I definitely don't think that there is one definition for happiness, but when it comes to the topic of this talk and talking about Ruby makes my brain happy, I think there are some key things that I want to pull out to define what I mean by happiness in that context. Ruby is really fun. This is a completely biased opinion. I talked about developers being opinionated, but Ruby is way more fun than other languages. That is my opinion. That is how I feel. When I'm coding something for fun, when I'm doing some coding challenge, or I just have complete choice of what I'm going to work in, I'm going to do it in Ruby because it is so much fun. It's just fun. It's also familiar. Familiarity makes our brains really happy. It makes them feel like things make sense. It's comfortable. And yeah, obviously Ruby's only going to be familiar to me because I have some experience working in Ruby, but I also have experience working in JavaScript. And to me, they do feel different. I feel like Ruby is familiar because it suits the way that my brain wants to think. Working with Ruby feels like home. Happiness doesn't have to be an active state all the time either. When it comes to making our brains happy, they like to feel that things are comfortable. The sense of contentment, I think, is another sign of our brains being happy with the way that we're working and the environments that we're working in. When it feels right. A state of flow. Getting into a state of flow is something that is going to happen a lot more easily when we're working in ways that work for our brains. So actually getting into something and staying in a state of flow I personally find it a lot easier to do that in Ruby than I do in other languages. Partly that's familiarity with the language, but it's also, I believe, to do with the way that our brains map onto the concepts of the language that we're working in. Trust. It might sound weird to talk about trust in terms of a programming language, but for me, when I'm working in Ruby, when I'm working in Rails, I definitely get stuck on stuff. I get stuck on stuff all the time. I don't know how to even approach some things sometimes, or I'll get stuck on a bug. But when it comes down to it, even if I end up having to get help to get unstuck, I have a level of trust with the language. I trust that in the end, it's going to actually make sense most of the time. I think that level of trust is important to not sort of just getting stuck. When you can trust that you're going to be able to figure it out, or even with help, you'll get there and it's going to make sense in the end, at least most of the time, that can be a really valuable thing to helping you keeping moving forward. One thing about our brains is they tend to work best when they get what they want. But our brains aren't always good at telling us what they need or what they want. One of the ways that they do that is through us having preferences for things. So it might be that we have a favorite color, or we'd really prefer to have the lighting a certain way, or that kind of thing. It might be a craving for a particular food. So I think it's pretty commonly understood that cravings for food can be because our body needs something. Our brain knows that and it's trying to get us to act. When it comes to the hobbies that we enjoy doing, and coding may be one of those, then we also have preferences within them. Even the very fact that we might choose to code rather than do some other hobby, that is a preference. And I think it's really valuable for us to listen to our brains. Not all the time. We have to do things that we have to do as well, but when we can, at least be aware of the things that our brains are telling us in terms of preferences for doing particular things or doing them in particular ways. That can be really helpful both to decide what to do, but also to know about that even when we have to do things that we prefer not to do. Of course, it's always possible that our brains are just being lazy. That's definitely a thing that happens. And I think that comes back to something I was saying earlier around we need to make sure that we are balancing putting our brains in a good state where they're happy, where they're comfortable, and growth. And actually these things come together. If we're talking about those internal schemas that we have where we're actually adapting our schemas internally as new information becomes available to us over time, for most of us, our brains actually want to be doing that. That growth that happens in that regard is actually feeding back into our brains being happy, and that's us going through that cycle. That's that cognitive development or that learning cycle. We're actually learning new things and assimilating that knowledge and accommodating that knowledge, and we need to stretch ourselves just like other muscles in our body. Our brain needs to be stretched. Our brain needs to actually be pushed to grow. But we can push it in ways that work for us, and we can do that better if we understand what works for us. We can do that in ways that help to make our brains happy. Whether it's the hardware that we're working with, like our keyboards and so on, or the text editors we use, the operating systems that we use, the programming languages that we work in, it can be really beneficial for us to have tools and environments that we're working with that actually just feel like an extension of us. We want the way that we're working to feel as natural as possible and to both get out of our way and facilitate the ways that we work so that we can focus on the right things. We can focus on our growth in the right areas. We can focus on our productivity with our work. The more that we can work in ways that work for us, the more work we're going to get through. For me, coding in Ruby is like that. Coding in Ruby is like having a great conversation where you've got your conversation partner and you're kind of having a great conversation, and you've got the great back and forth, and it all feels really synergistic. And I don't know exactly what Ruby's getting out of the conversation that I'm having with it, but I know that I'm getting a lot, so that's good. Ruby, what's special about Ruby? Let's talk about that. So I'm going to start with a quote by Matt. The creator of the Ruby programming language said, "I believe that the purpose of life is, at least in part, to be happy. Based on this belief, Ruby is designed to make programming not only easy, but also fun. It allows you to concentrate on the creative side of programming with less stress." Ruby is designed for programmer happiness. It's got simple, natural language and syntax, a focus on simplicity and productivity. It's designed for developing apps quickly, and it facilitates the writing of clean, easy to understand code. And I actually think that every single point on that slide has been shown at some point over the last 2 days. These have been coming up as some of the things that people are wanting to talk about at RubyConf, which I think is pretty cool. One more quote. I'll let you read that one for yourselves. I think that something that makes Ruby really special as well is not just that it was designed for programmer happiness, but also that it was designed by somebody who was aware that not every language is going to work for everyone. He wasn't actually trying to design the language that will do everything for everyone. Matt was designing a language that he wanted to code in. And that's awesome. He wasn't trying to make it everything for everyone. He knew that it couldn't be, and he didn't even try. It wasn't his goal. He made a language that made him happy to program in, and he hopes that it does that for other people. And so, one person making a language that they want to code in, I think it does make sense that that ends up being a language that does work for many other people as well, but it absolutely won't work for everyone. Ruby makes my brain happy. Ruby works for me, and I reckon I'm probably in a biased audience where probably Ruby works well for a lot of us here, but happy to debate that later. Let's talk a little bit now about how we can put some of the things that I've talked about today into practice. It's all well and good for Bianca to stand up here and talk about their brain being happy, but what does that mean for you? How can this be useful? I think it can be really useful for us to understand ourselves. If we're listening to what it is that we love, if we're listening to what our brains tell us, that can give us information that we can work with. By knowing that I prefer to code in Ruby compared to JavaScript, but also knowing that I do want to be able to code really well in JavaScript, I can use that information to my advantage. When I'm bashing my head against some JavaScript and I'm really not enjoying it, then I at least have some information available to me. I can act on that in many, many ways, but at least I'm understanding myself better. I can understand the experience that I'm going through better. I can use that to help me make good choices. Our brains know what we need, and I think it's really useful and important that we actually listen to them. And again, balancing that comfort and growth. Having that balance between doing things that make our brains happy, doing things that work for us in a way that works for us, and making sure that we're pushing ourselves outside of our comfort zone and doing that in ways that will work for us as well. Understanding others. So most of us work with other people in the companies that we work in. Whether it's other developers or other people in other areas of the business, or both, most of us are working with other people. And I think it's really, really important to remember that everyone is different. And we have had a few different talks over the last 2 days that have talked about this, but one thing that I want to come back to is that idea that we're all opinionated. And we are all opinionated, and I think that's great, and I think that it makes perfect sense that we should be. But it's really important as well to actually remember that those opinions are coming from our perspectives. They're coming from my opinions are coming from the perspective of what works for me and the experiences that I've had. And so they're not necessarily going to apply directly to other people. The fact that I love Ruby, that Ruby works for me, doesn't mean that it's the right language for somebody else. Combining that with Matt's is nice and so we're nice, I think that can help to really propagate a fantastic way of thinking when we're working with others and when we're trying to understand where others are coming from. Open-minded opinions is what I was just talking about, but I wanted to specifically talk about getting people into coding because it's something that I think is really important, and obviously I spend a lot of time in that industry. But having those open-minded opinions can be really, really important in that kind of setting because, as I said, when I was going through the bootcamp, I was reading a lot of stuff online about how JavaScript is the thing you should focus on. That is what you should do if you're getting into web development. In all honesty, if I did JavaScript as my first language and that was the only thing that I learnt, I'm not sure that I would have been as passionate about coding. I'll never know, but I know that my brief foray into C++ certainly didn't convert me to wanting to code. So, I don't know, there's something there. I think on that note, though, broad exposure to programming languages can be really, really useful and is really, really important as well. When people are just starting to learn to code, something that I saw all the time when I was working in that industry of getting people into coding was that everyone had their opinion on what was the best language for people to learn first. And typically it was either Ruby or Python. It was typically a split between Ruby or Python. And some people would say other things, but ultimately I think by having a broad exposure to different languages, to different programming paradigms, that gives people the best chance of actually finding something that is a fit for them. Finding their love of programming through a language that works for them. And that certainly doesn't mean that they can't go on to further learn other languages, but actually getting them hooked on programming is probably going to work out better if they get a chance to be exposed to a language that works well for them. There are also many advantages in terms of our internal schemas adapting as we learn new things and being exposed to different programming languages and different programming paradigms. By being exposed to these different things over time, people who are in the industry, new and more experienced, their internal schemas are going to adapt and they're going to have different ways that they can think about the work that they're doing in whatever language and frameworks they are working in. Safety to try it in terms of learning to code is really just about being an awesome community, and I feel like Ruby kind of has that built in already. But that awesome community that makes it safe to try something, safe to try it and fail, somewhere to get support from, that kind of thing is really, really important. And also, I think I'm going to come back to it again and say that at every level of experience, it's important to have that balance between happiness and growth. One final quote. There are two ways to look at a language. One is by looking at what can be done with that language. The other is by looking at how we feel using that language, how we feel while programming. This comes back to what I was talking about earlier, where there are kind of different ways to look at a language and why you should learn one language over another and why you should pursue a particular path. And what I want to say today is it's not just important to do what everyone else is doing. It's not just important to do what's most popular in industry. I love picking up the new shiny tool as well, but it's not the only thing that matters. Working in a way that works for us, making our brains happy, that matters too. Ruby makes my brain happy, and brain happiness matters. The happiness of our brains matter. It matters for health. It matters for productivity. It matters for fulfillment. It helps us to learn. If we're working in an environment where things actually work for our brains, we actually learn better. It helps to fight burnout. And problem-solving capacity goes way up if we're actually enjoying ourselves. Ruby makes my brain happy, and I would love to hear what makes your brains happy too. Thank you.